Broadway has expanded its borders once again. Audiences are used to seeing shows in cities across the country and in London, but now the stage is set for more and more productions in Asia and around the world. Hello, I'm Gordon Cox from Variety, and with us today to talk about the new world market for theater are Simone Genatt, chairman of Broadway Asia, Robert Nederlander Jr., president and CEO of Nederlander Worldwide Entertainment, and Alan Wasser, general manager, Alan Wasser Associates. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder if we could start off talking about the sort of history of sort of New York producers starting to look at the international market beyond what we traditionally have seen sort of on the road and in London.
I think it probably goes as far back as A Chorus Line, which was the first production of international interest that merited multiple productions and touring by English language companies around the world. I think it started roughly at that era.
It was about, I think it was about 50 or 60 years ago. The Japanese were the first really to bring American Broadway musicals into the marketplace. And I think, you're right, I think it was Chorus Line and Sophisticated Ladies were the early ones that went into the marketplace.
What about Chorus Line, for instance, in particular, attracted their attention, do you think?
I think the universality of the show, principally, and the fact that it was an international hit. Broadway, until I suppose about the Chorus Line era, a Broadway producer would usually acquire rights to produce or co-produce reproductions of the Broadway production in English-speaking territories, UK and Australia, New Zealand, basically. And I think you're right. In the last, say, 30 to 40 years ago, or more, interest in particular from Japan started to open people's eyes about maybe going beyond just the English language territories.
Right. And what have you found that Broadway overall as a brand means internationally?
Broadway is an incredibly powerful brand, much more powerful even than it is in the American system. It really denotes money, the best of the West, and non-political entertainment, which crosses cultural barriers everywhere and draws a lot of support and financial support and sponsorship. And when a market emerges, an economy emerges, they tend to brand themselves with Broadway. That's what's happened over the last 20 years. So that as the emerging markets have come into the system, whether it was Latin America or China or Dubai or any of these markets, they tend to brand themselves with Broadway to show that they are a market to be reckoned with and a market that has clout and money.
And how did that happen? How are international audiences, Bob, for instance, you've said to me that people in China know Sound of Music very well. Is that
Sure.
right? How? Where are they exposed to it?
Well, specifically for the Chinese market, you had several shows that were presented to a Chinese audience through television during the Cultural Revolution or soon thereafter. Sound of Music was one of those shows. You had Death of a Salesman, Singing in the Rain, were shows that were made familiar to a Chinese audience well before there was any real interaction between the West and China.
And what was it about those shows that caused them to be selected?
I believe it was illustrative of perhaps the best and worst of Western society, Western culture, with their selection. It certainly did, however, open the door for those shows to come in, and Simone led that effort with Sound of Music into China.
And can you tell us a little bit about that, about the decision to bring over Sound of Music and what people's sort of reaction to the show was?
Entertainment of this sort, Western entertainment, fell under the area of propaganda until the last 7 or 8 years in mainland China. And they were very restrictive about what was allowed into the system. And as Bob said very clearly, the Chinese government chose really 2 or 3 pieces of our literature to educate their people by, that they allowed into the system. One was Sound of Music. They loved Sound of Music. Everything about Sound of Music they loved. They admire it. They taught it in their high schools. Everybody learned how to sing Do, Re, Mi in mainland China. And I knew this in the mid-'80s. It was the first tour to go into mainland China to tour really what is 15 cities in the marketplace, and do 60 weeks of touring across Asia, which really was unheard of. And it was our goal to try to develop the marketplace as an expanded touring route for exploitation by Broadway product into the future. And Sound of Music really paved that way. It's one of those shows that everyone loves in the international markets. You know, any market that is emerging will always do Sound of Music as an opener. But as Bob said, you know, the Chinese chose Sound of Music to show the beauty of our culture, and they chose Death of a Salesman to show how we mistreat our elderly and how the American system really doesn't work, and that the downfall of America. And then they had Fantastics and Singing in the Rain. I mean, that's basically what that was the breadth of their knowledge, essentially, until Bob and I got together and started introducing some other Broadway shows into the marketplace. But they, you know, up to that time, it's only been the last 7 or 8 years that they've opened up.
You know, interestingly, I think growing interest around the world in Broadway theater is very much an economic function.
I agree.
Because if you go back, say, 50 years, at that time, American musicals, as I mentioned before, might get reproduced in London and in Australia, but not much beyond that. Japan was the first market to come on that expressed a real interest in American musicals, and again, I think that coincided with Japan's increasing prominence in the world economy. Europe has always been a reasonably strong, well, since the 60s at least, strong territory for Broadway musicals. Major titles, generally. West Side Story, for example, was a perennial in Europe, both in terms of being produced locally by local theater companies as well as touring. What's interesting, I think, about the last 15 years or so is the huge development of Asia. Yes. And again, I think it's an economic, it's as a result of economic improvement in those countries. The best example I can think of in that respect is in 1991, at the invitation of the government of Singapore, we took the US touring company of Les Miserables to Singapore, which by then had just completed 15 years of explosive economic growth. And Cameron McIntosh told me about a conversation he had with a Singaporean official in which Cameron asked, "Why are you interested in this show all of a sudden?" And his response was to say, "Well, we spent the last 2 decades working hard and building an economy and making money and creating a very quite wealthy society. Now we want to enjoy some of the fruits of that." And their first view was to the American musical, which and British musicals, I think, by that era.
Both.
That they had become familiar with from afar. And I think we've seen that trend then develop. So certainly now China is the most explosive area for that, but also for other Far Eastern markets and even markets outside of Europe and the Far East. South Africa is starting to show more and more interest in Broadway musicals and London musicals. Dubai, you mentioned. Yes. Again, very much a function of economics.
Dubai, there was a time when Dubai first came into the world view, and the New York Times article had not come out yet. Through my website, in 1 week, I got approached by 10 parties from Dubai, and I had absolutely no idea where Dubai was on the map, what its purpose was, and it hadn't really emerged yet. But what we've seen over the last 20 years of doing this is that when a market comes into its own financially, as Alan was saying, they look to Broadway to brand themselves. It's a fascinating process, and we have actually preceded the economic explosions. So it's happening within the marketplace, but it hasn't really hit the global market in terms of awareness, but they reach out to us before that and then use Broadway as a branding mechanism.
And can you generalize about what kinds of shows tend to work abroad?
I think shows that cross cultural lines, that are universal in their appeal. You can name any number of American musicals from the past, for example, that don't meet that criterion, that are very American and very specific to our culture. But I think the initial interest.
Can you give us an example?
Hairspray?
Yeah.
And Hairspray crosses, but for a different reason than what Alan's saying. I mean,
if you go back to Pajama Game, for example, it's really an American product. Yeah. I think certainly the British mega musicals of the 80s certainly met that criterion. Chorus Line met it. Absolutely. Sound of Music met it. Yeah. I suppose even I'm not sure about this, a title like Annie, perhaps?
Annie has, but mainly licenses, because touring a dog is somewhat problematic.
But actually, there's an interesting exception or maybe extension of that notion, which is a show like Chicago, which has had huge international
Yes.
exploitation, but it's a very American piece.
I think that also it's a combination, as Alan was saying, of what is universal from our market, but also what is the most successful. They're interested in what's most successful and most regarded and the best of. So, something like Chicago or Hairspray, which, is much more Americana in its positioning, is also very successful in the international markets because it's won the Tony Awards and it won its Academy Awards and it did the, Hollywood and Broadway. That sells as well. And little musicals sell a lot. There's a huge marketplace throughout Asia for the I Love You, You're Perfect Now Change and Toxic Avengers and Rooms, and we do tons of those musicals in local languages across the marketplace. There's a huge appetite for those little musicals.
Does that have to do with they're sort of produced on a smaller scale and therefore ticket prices are less, or is it just a...
There's a very active, small off-Broadway style communities throughout these Asian markets, young demographics, and they produce local language productions, and it's more cost effective, and they're edgier.
Our focus is China, given the enormous opportunities there, and certainly the tremendous growth we've seen over the last couple of years. But there is certainly there's price sensitivity. If you are not, if you don't have a brand, something that is Tony Awards, success on Broadway, there's less of a willingness to pay. There are still high ticket prices for Chinese audiences, and this isn't just Shanghai and Beijing. You're talking a dozen or more cities across the country. So what smaller productions allow you to do is to, of course, make these shows affordable to an audience willing to take perhaps spend on something other than the brand that they've heard of.
You've all mentioned Tony Awards as sort of a major indicator of internationally of a show's success. Are there other things that point international attention in the direction of a show?
Well, a successful run on Broadway, a successful run in the West End.
Long runs.
Interestingly, film adaptations sometimes. The conventional wisdom once was that if you had a show running on Broadway, it would be suicide to have the film released. Chicago proved that to be untrue.
Phantom of the Opera also.
Phantom of the Opera. What's also interesting, I think, about where things are going now is that there are sort of two aspects, two ways in which American theater is reaching, across the oceans. One is productions that are sent to visit, basically, U.S.-based tours that may go to Japan or China or other places, inevitably performed in English with surtitles. The other development, which is still I think rather in the more nascent stages, is local production of high quality. There are increasingly local theater companies, local organizations who are taking on the challenges of producing Broadway musicals to a very high standard, a higher standard than you would ordinarily have thought. So I don't think those two types of productions are necessarily in competition with one another.
No.
But both are growing, I think it's fair to say, as we speak.
What in particular in China is a challenge in working there?
Taking Broadway to China or China here?
Both.
Both.
Yeah. Let's start with Broadway to China.
Well, first, understanding the environment in China is, as Simone mentioned, it's relatively new. As they refer to it, the cultural industry is only very recently opened itself up to foreign shows. Fortunately, Broadway doesn't face the same restrictions that the movie industry does. There is a challenge with licenses and approvals. I'm not aware of any Broadway show which has not received the license.
One, Vagina Monologues.
So where we go.
But honestly, it's an interesting thing to note. But Bob's right. Besides that, Rent got in, barely, but Rent got in, but Vagina Monologues did not.
we haven't had any resistance to the shows that we've either taken in or have proposed. Unlike, and I'm not aware of any quotas as they have in the music with movies, the motion picture industry. You've got cultural issues. Language makes that a challenge. Meshing your Western technical staff with their Chinese counterparts is a challenge, and taking touring shows across China is relatively new. 42nd Street was the first show to tour extensively across China.
What year was that?
That was
Actually,
1997.
Sound of Music preceded it, and then 42nd Street. And 42nd Street we did together. It was our production. We produced and managed, and Bob toured.
I see.
42nd Street had was the most extensive at that time. We did 10 cities, and many of these cities hadn't seen Broadway before. And Simone has plenty of stories, as do I, and some of those breaking the ice, introducing the concept of what's expected for our productions, and
how do you do that?
yeah,
You do a lot of praying.
It was takes a lot of advanced work, and it's you also learn from experience. Now there's experience in the market with extensive tours. We follow that up with AIDA, and also toured through 10 cities, and we'll bring Fame at the end of the year, which will do a similar tour. And I know Simone's had similar experiences. It's with time and experience, it certainly gets better.
I think also part of the challenge of mainland China as a marketplace is that the cities are very isolationist. There isn't communication amongst the parties, really. They don't want to share information. They're very much islands unto themselves. I mean, we've toured shows now in 27 cities across mainland China. So I really know this country inside and out, and the variation of the tiers of the marketplace. And they really range considerably in terms of, their knowledge, their approach, and it's also about negotiation. I mean, we are a very specific territory about how we do contracts and how we negotiate. And our way of negotiating is we get a contract, we finish it, and we assume that under most circumstances people will stick to it. In China, you finish a contract and it's the start of the negotiation, and it goes all the way until you leave. And if you don't know that, that's why most businessmen cannot do deals with the Chinese, because it's just that's not the way they function. I mean, Bob can tell you, Bob and I also did West Side Story together in Beijing, and
when was that?
That was.
It was spring of 2007.
Is that right? Yeah. So, and it had never been in the marketplace. It was the first time, and we did it at a festival together. And so. It's really it's a huge cultural difference in terms of where we are. We expect accountability as Americans. There's very little accountability in mainland China.
As a lawyer, we're also, of course, our training is to understand the rule of law is something which has something we can rely on with our contracts. And again, it's in China, it's not always clear what the rules are. And the contracts are according to our Western experience, our Western standards. It is viewed a bit differently there. And understanding that and having the flexibility to work within that environment is essential.
I think it's also true, Bob, that you and I have been very involved in the last 3 to 5 years with actually creating law and creating regulations and creating systems with them that really actually don't exist at this point.
And part of that is, I'm sure Simone has had similar experiences. One of the fundamental differences, and this isn't just true with China, but there is a Ministry of Culture in China. It regulates the industry. You're required to apply for, again, licenses to enter the country. to conform to certain rules in your relationships with local presenters and media, and interacting, learning, understanding what those rules are and what's permitted. It's not always in writing. I mean, again,
It's rarely in
it's
writing.
opaque, and
It's rarely in writing.
you learn this from experience, having reliable partners who can help guide you through what can be a
Local partners.
local partners,
Yeah.
a difficult process. When I remember, I feel in many cases I almost serve as a cultural ambassador. Times I find quite a bit of my time is spent with government officials, both primarily in support of course, our activities, which is not just bringing shows into China, but managing theaters, helping them to develop what they refer to as their cultural industry. But also representing the interests of the theatrical, the entertainment community in the United States.
And Alan, you were just with Dreamgirls in Korea.
Yes.
Did you find what was that experience like for you in terms
Well,
of
it's an experience
cultural?
we're still going through as we speak.
Yeah.
A very interesting experience, and one which I think might provide some key lessons for the future. And I think unlike any arrangement for an American musical being done overseas that I'm aware of to date, essentially the Korean production of what developed was that there was a local theater company in Korea that was interested in mounting a major production of Dreamgirls. And they approached John Brelio, who represents the Dreamgirls estate and is also a producer in his own right. And he came up with the idea of possibly doing a co-production, which basically involved what we did was we built the set for the show in America, built the costumes in Korea, and engaged an American creative team, director and designers and musical staff. And that creative team went to Korea, rehearsed a local Korean company in Korean, which was a major challenge, as you can imagine. And all the elements were brought together there for a 20-week run at the Charlotte Theater, mostly financed and paid for by the Korean producer. At the end of that run, the set came back to the US, and we're now, as I say, literally in technical rehearsals at the Apollo Theater to open the same production, but with an American cast, entirely recast with an African-American cast appropriate to America. What was interesting about the experience is that when you're developing a new production, usually you spend your time in a rehearsal hall and then you get into the theater and everything is a surprise and you're working all kinds of different problems out. In this case, what was interesting was that the Korean engagement, at least from our point of view, was primarily working out technical and production and design issues, because it was pretty difficult for the creative team to know what was being said since it was performed in Korean. And so we had the luxury of really fine-tuning the design, the lighting, and all of the other elements, so that bringing the production here now, since we've got that under our belt, the focus is very much upon the performance and the cast performance and the direction.
So you sort of tried out way out of town.
We tried the set out of town.
Yeah, exactly.
Brought it back. There was one very interesting cultural, I think very much of what we're talking about here has to do with cultural differences and meeting the challenges of cultural differences, but there was one very interesting one, I think, on Dreamgirls, which was that William Ivy Long, our costume designer, was very specific about the fact when we built the show, we built the costumes in Korea for the Korean cast, and there was discussion of, well, we'll bring those costumes back to the States and use them in the US. And the first reaction to that was, it's not good practice to cast any production by fitting the costume, obviously. But more importantly, he felt rather strongly and rightly that the color palette that he would need to work with to work with a Korean cast and Asian complexion and so forth was very different from what was needed in using an African American cast. Different color palette, subtle differences, but important differences. And so as a result, the notion of building the costumes and bringing them back never played out. Although what we did do was to build a second set of costumes, not here, but in Korea, which saved an enormous amount of money in remounting the show for the United States. But also that exercise, building the set of costumes, wouldn't have been possible if the Korean shops hadn't already gone through doing it once for a production. It's been a very interesting experience, and one we're still going through. But so far, it's been a very satisfying and happy experience for us.
Yeah.
And Simone, tell us a little bit about, you just got back from China from a show that you developed there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
We were hired by the mayor and vice mayor of the district of Beijing to executive produce a brand new Broadway-style musical. We executed contracts with them 5 months ago, and we started production 3.5 months ago. And my colleagues here who know very well producing for a brand new musical in 3.5 months of time, and they built us a new theater. So they built a brand new theater from a flat piece of land. Shows the innovation and expertise of the Chinese when they really want something. I mean, they're very driven people, without question. So we created this brand new musical. It's a fusion of Hollywood movie musicals, the best of Broadway music, and Chinese cinema. We got full support from Hollywood and from Broadway. It's a combination of a piece that has music from Julie Stein and Sondheim and Bernstein and Rodgers and Hammerstein and Richard Adler and Comden and Green. I mean, it's the best of, and it's a story, and it's pretty amazing. It's one hit after the next.
Where did the story come from? Who?
My partner Mark Roth and I conceived it. We hired a writer from Hollywood who was a friend of mine from college, actually.
Was that 3.5 months ago that this happened?
That was
or?
3.5 months ago. That was 3.5 months ago. I'll tell you, I haven't slept in 3.5 months. I don't think I'll sleep again for another 6.
That would be my typical text to Simone. Where are you today?
I said, I can't have breakfast with you. I'm sorry. I'm trying to make sure there are walls on this theater before I kill someone. You know, it was an astounding process. I mean, it's an awesome show. It worked. You know, we did it as a shorter version because we knew we were climbing a massive mountain. Show runs about 75 minutes right now. Probably will expand not that much more. And
it's a Broadway, or rather American creative team?
It's a Broadway creative team. It's a Broadway company of, you know, equity performers.
And so then what happens next with this production?
This production will run through December 10th in mainland China, and then it will...
In one venue or
in one venue.
This is Beijing?
In Huairou,
okay.
Beijing. It's a district of Beijing. And then it will... we already have tremendous interest for it to tour. So we'll take it down, we'll develop it a little bit, and then we'll go out and tour in mainland China, opening somewhere between March and June, and then across Asia. So our first focal point, from a rights point of view and a copyright point of view and intellectual property, because there was a lot of very powerful parties at the table, we focused on Asia to get it up on its feet, and we're happy with it. It worked. It's quite an amazing feat.
Can we also talk a little bit about bringing international fare into New York specifically, or into America, but specifically New York? I know you've had experience with that. What are the challenges going in that direction?
Well, we brought Soul of Shaolin to the Marquee last January. It was a 3-week run of a show produced by our Shanghai partners. This is a group that does have considerable experience in the entertainment market in China. They had taken the show to Australia and several other places, but this was the first experience. In fact, this was the first Chinese show to play on Broadway. There were challenges in explaining the differences between Broadway, union rules in particular, which we're all familiar with.
It's a daily conversation happening right now.
Yeah.
Which was something that was understood conceptually, but to understand the need to work within a particular framework it's just a bit different, and part of this is cultural as well in ways we've discussed earlier on this program. So,
did you find that there were challenges in marketing it to American audiences, marketing the show to American audiences?
It's awfully difficult to present a show for 3 weeks on Broadway, given the costs here. But it was a tremendous success for us. We certainly exceeded expectations, both our expectations as well as our Chinese partners. Remember back in January, there was still uncertainty here on Broadway as to what one could expect with the economy, and of course all the press of the 13 shows that had closed recently. And we certainly felt that this would be of interest to not just a traditional Broadway audience, but to the Asian American community, and of course the Chinese community, both here in New York City and the tri-state area. And that was an important part of our marketing initiative. This is a demographic which does not traditionally attend Broadway, and it was as much an education, well, what is Broadway, why is this interesting to me, as well as bringing them to see a show that appealed to their ethnic roots.
We've brought 3 shows in to the United States from different parts of the world. We're pretty selective about that because we're looking for things that are contemporary. The first one was Cookin' Nanta that came from Korea, that we actually executive produced and developed with them and launched throughout the international territories, and it ran for 18 months off Broadway, and it toured the United States 3 times. It was very, very successful in the marketplace. We were very happy with it. It's fun. It's fun entertainment. It was, The next thing that we brought in was the Vietnamese water puppets. My partner Mark Routh was on an airplane on his way flying somewhere in Asia, and he opened one of the airplane magazines, and he called me up and he says, there's this gorgeous 10-page spread of these puppets. What should we do? I said, go to Vietnam, get them, And he went there and he signed a contract with them. We brought them over. And that was actually very challenging because we did it from a cultural point of view. We thought they were beautiful. There were these beautiful little puppets that would, big. I mean, they were 3.5 feet puppets that swam through this pool. And it turned out to be a political statement that we weren't ready for. And when we opened at UCLA, we had about 2,000 protesters, and the terrorism unit got called out by UCLA. It was fascinating. I mean, we got called to a sit down with like the Vietnamese about cultural issues. I mean, we were doing this completely for cultural exchange. It was pretty little puppets swimming around in a pool, We had absolutely no idea the impact that it was going to have.
When was this? What year?
This was probably 1998, maybe, something around there, 1996.
So what was the political concern?
Where these puppets came from and the side that they were on from Vietnam, and I mean, it was really,
local.
It was an internal thing that we had. There was no possibility we could have foreseen in any way. So that was a different kind of experience. And the third one we did is we recently co-produced I Love You, You're Perfect Now Change in Chinese. It was the first production done in Chinese with a Chinese pop star that we co-financed with a very, very well-known group out of Shanghai called Shanghai Dramatic Arts Center. And we brought them into New York, where they ran for 4 weeks in Shanghai and 2 weeks in Beijing, and then we brought them into New York, where they ran in rep opposite the American company. So every other night they ran in English and then in Chinese and English and Chinese. And they were great. It was definitely challenging. It was definitely challenging because, as Bob said, the Chinese community is not really a theater-going community by practice, per se. And it's hard to reach the second-generation Asians in the United States.
Well, actually, let's also talk a little bit about that. I've talked to both of you about the infrastructure that you have had to sort of try to build in China. The sort of theater-going infrastructure, and I remember, if I remember correctly, one of them was sort of educating people about buying tickets and when to buy tickets and how to buy tickets. Can you tell me a little bit about that, and then a little bit more about some of the other infrastructure things you're working on?
It's China, up until 7-8 years ago, did not have the habit of purchasing tickets. These were, first of all, it was a question of, is there something that was truly interesting to see? And then there's a question of, well, how does one go to see these shows? And it was through, tickets were given away, whether it's through employers or otherwise. So the part of the challenge that we all face is, how do you change the culture of attending a show? And of course, there's no industry if you cannot purchase, no commercial industry if you cannot, if people are not willing to purchase tickets. And certainly Shanghai, the most international city in China, is very strong, has a very strong single ticket market. We're seeing that in some of the other cities along the coast, but there's still some challenges in some of the interior cities. And Simone and I have our challenges. We find the right partners who also share a common interest in developing this ticket buying habit.
Also, there's no credit cards, so it's a cash business. Now credit cards are emerging in the last 2 or 3 years, with the onset of the Olympics and Visa getting involved in the Olympics, and now the World Expo next year in Shanghai. They need to deal with credit cards. But even when you go to sophisticated areas of Beijing and you hand them an American Express card, I did last week at a restaurant, I handed my American Express card and they said, "Oh, no, this is only America." And I said, no, this is international. It's American Express, You can take this credit card. And they were like, "No, I cannot take this credit card. This is only for America." So, it's not a credit card system. And also there's no specific location to buy tickets. You can't call TicketCharge or Telecharge or something, and figure out, who you're talking to, or, there's no one to talk to. There's no one who knows what's going on.
And it's not just one ticketing service. You may have a dozen or more who are all brokers, perhaps working for one central ticketing group. And just as important, tickets are not purchased through the internet, not yet. And in part, that's a concern about the limited use of credit cards.
They've started to be purchased, actually. This show that we're doing right now, they're purchased through your phone. It's actually a Korean invention. We don't have really in the United States yet. We are not as sophisticated as they are in their technology. The Koreans actually developed this, where you can bring your phone in and you flash it, and your ticket's off your phone. The Chinese actually have that now, so they're very inventive in terms of using their cell phones right now. So they do advertising and marketing on their cell phones openly, and they sell tickets through their cell phones. So they have a credit plan where they can charge from their cell phone plan to buy tickets right now. So that's what they're doing. It's more a debit system than it is a credit system, because they don't really trust the credit system yet.
Can we also talk a little bit about the existence of theaters that are appropriate for sort of Broadway-style musicals, and are there? I get the impression that you've had to work on sort of developing those theaters and creating venues for shows to run.
Well, as Simone said, if they don't have the theater, they'll build it in a few months. So
they do. It's true.
The amount of activity on the infrastructure side of this business is just staggering.
Yes.
We're looking at literally hundreds of theaters that are under construction across China. A project we're involved with in Beijing is currently planned for 17. This is one district in Beijing. There are similar developments that are planned in major markets across China, and the facilities are they will come. They're in the works. They're designed at the very they're designed for international to accept a wide range of international productions, not just Broadway, of course, and that is changing the landscape. Prior to this, we had a selection of one or two. That for years, Simone and I would talk about in Shanghai, you have one or two that you would look at, and now that's changing.
I think also we have to recognize China is a 2,000-year-old culture that has thousands and thousands and thousands of performance troupes. We just happen to be the interesting taste of the time right now, and there's a lot of reasons for that in mainland China. It's because we're commercial art. Commercial art is fascinating to them as the businessmen that the Chinese are. The Chinese are businessmen. Chinese want to do deals, and they want to trying to figure out how to take their troop system, which they employ, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million people in their troop systems across China, and convert them into something that is self-propagating at this point. And so they're really studying our system very, very carefully because, Alan's job is to make a show and make sure that it works financially, that's what we're very conscious of those things when we go into doing a production. And they have never been until this point, because when they spend a couple $1 million on doing a show, it runs 2 performances and they close it. That's what they've been doing. So they look at us and they say, oh, you guys are doing something smart. You're paying attention to the financial part of this. So I think that part of the reason we're really interesting is for that purpose. But there are a lot of performing arts centers, where opera has been done and acrobatics has been done and dance and ballet, that they precede us by thousands of years, in terms of their art forms. So they needed these grand theaters regardless. And I think something important that Alan said earlier, which he noticed out of Singapore when he did Les Mis there is a definite movement across Asia. I mean, we have shows running, I think, in 10 countries right now across the marketplace. And there is a definite movement across Asia right now that culture enhances better living. And each of these markets has slogans that say that.
And I think there's an understanding that certainly I've seen that in Shanghai and Beijing, that culture is good for business. That certainly everything that Simone has mentioned is important, is an important consideration certainly in China to promote culture. But there's also an understanding, hey, this is good for our economy. This is good for our city,
yeah.
our province, and look how culture has successfully revitalized Times Square, for instance, or perhaps there are other examples around the world. We want to bring that here. It's good for business.
I mean, Korea shifted from an industrial nation to a cultural and technology nation in the last 5 years. I mean, literally the entire focus of the government went from industry to culture and technology. They call it CT. It's the CT movement, called the Korean Wave, which, Alan has been able to take advantage of with Dreamgirls in a really interesting way. I mean, we have 7 shows in Korea right now, and they're all local productions. And the market's hot for it. I mean, as we were talking about earlier, Korea, I started going to Korea in 1987. I think I went to Korea for the first time. And they have a huge off-Broadway industry. When I went there in 1987, there were maybe 40 theaters between the size of 50 to 350 seats. Now, there are 450 of those theaters. So the market is just, and the government has focused on this, and Korea has profited tremendously in this area in terms of becoming the focal point for culture and technology, because they're really interestingly situated between Japan and China right now. And they're creative, and they have a huge musical theater industry, So, they're focused on this area.
You're absolutely correct about Seoul in particular, that it's an enormous theater scene there with even local awards ceremonies and a real theater community. What's interesting about that, though, is that it reflects, I think, increasing appetite and increasing interest for Western-style entertainment, for musicals in particular, American musicals, and I think that's leading now to local development of local musicals based upon a Western model.
Yes.
Now, whether or not those productions, locally developed, are going to find their way back here, and then whether or not there will be a genuine sort of back and forth of new work, as there is between the U.S. and the U.K., is something I think was one of the more interesting things to keep an eye for in the future.
I think you're right. Korea has developed a bunch of those. But the biggest thing they don't understand that we have learned through pain over the years is that there's a lot of development needed to make these musicals work. They think you make it, you produce it, you open it, you spend all your money, and that's very problematic right now.
Well, indeed, our Korean experience very much made that clear to us.
I'm sure.
It was a very big production, it's very complicated. And there are even interesting aspects of production, and even aside from mounting local productions, taking a US-based production overseas. In addition to the cultural differences, when you asked what is the biggest challenge, the cultural differences from a macro point of view are from a micro point of view, translators. It's something as simple as that.
One thing we haven't talked about, when do you, can we talk a little bit about translation, and also when you decide to present a show in the local language versus in English?
Well, I think at least at the moment, the notion of presenting shows in a local language or an English language are two very separate endeavors, if I'm not mistaken, which is that at least insofar as American shows are going to the Far East, they're always performed in English, obviously, and not, you don't ask your cast to pick up the local language. But taking a production in my experience overseas, there were in the past, and less and less now, differences just in how you got a show on. You mentioned labor rules, union rules. The practice overseas is often very different from what we're accustomed to, and there are challenges there.
Absolutely.
Can we talk a little bit about the difference in producing costs, producing abroad versus here in New York?
Well, the only experience I have in that respect is what I mentioned before about building costumes in Seoul.
And was that less expensive primarily due to union?
The cost of labor was, yes, vastly less expensive. I can tell you that the costumes for the current production that we're about to begin touring, if built in the United States, would run somewhere around $2.5 million. And we're getting them, in this case, for $850,000.
Right, I was going to say, we opened a costume shop. We opened a costume shop about 3.5 years ago in the southern part of mainland China. We've built 5 shows out of there at this point. And the cost savings for an industry, I mean, if I went to Alan and I said, Alan, I can build your costumes for 40% of your cost from Broadway, which I will talk to him about later, they will, and it works, and there is a cost savings, and they're beautiful. I mean, we've built a lot of shows out of there right now, and they're quite magnificent.
There is one important lesson that we learned, interestingly, in this recent experience, which is that the direct cost that one pays to the costume shop is vastly lower. But if you're the American producer bringing costumes in, or any other physical production elements in from outside, you really have to plan on providing a lot more support, a lot more design support for the local shops. In the case of Dreamgirls, we had an associate costume designer literally moved to Seoul for 4 months to oversee the local shop in order to ensure that the costumes were built to a standard and to the designs that would be necessary here. It's a small investment compared to what one can save simply by taking advantage of the difference in labor rates in between the United States and virtually any other country.
Yes.
And what about the cost of just basic transportation for the set of Dreamgirls, for instance?
It's expensive.
I mean it's more expensive than a bus and truck, right?
Well, for an American production or to travel to the Far East, you always face the thorny issue of air versus sea. It's cheap to go by sea, it's very expensive to go by air. And it's tricky to take a US touring production, for example, and say, right, we'll go now to Seoul for 6 weeks, because you need to shut down if you're going to go by sea for 3 weeks before and after, and it's just not economic.
And the labor rules don't allow us to do it properly either. It's not just that it's not economic. I mean, it hurts us. We face very impactful costs because we need to ship it, but that the union regulations don't really allow us the time that we need to ship.
Exactly. For the most part, though, well, actually going back to the engagement of Les Miserables in Singapore, which was back in 1991, was kind of an interesting example of how we made it work economically, whereas at first glance it appeared to be an impossible challenge. We had a US touring company on the road at that time in the States. There had been an Australian production, which was a full reproduction of the London and New York versions of the show that had successfully toured Australia and then shut down. The set and costumes and everything had gone into storage. And when we were presented with the Singapore opportunity, what we did was to import by sea the set, the lighting equipment, the sound equipment from Australia to Singapore. Could take all its time to get there by sea. And then we sent the American cast with their costumes. And it was essentially a co-production between our Australian office and the New York office, working with the local theater in Singapore. It was one way to skin that cat, but that sort of thing can only be done when you've got you happen to have a set sitting in a warehouse.
No, you're right. I mean,
nearby.
we just recently did that with the producers. We did the producers in Japan. We represented Mel Brooks to do it in local language productions, both in Japan and Korea, which was quite a fascinating endeavor. And we shipped in the set from Australia. The company came from Japan. The creative team came from the United States, and they made it work. So,
there's another interesting challenge about it as well, and again, referring to American productions that play in the Far East. Because of the distance to get there, it's often advantageous if you're planning a Far East leg of a tour to try to book 3 or 4 cities, if you can do that, to lay off the cost and amortize the cost. The tricky part is to do just that in the Far East. You're doing a lot of flying because it's not exactly easy to get from Shanghai to Seoul.
that's right. People don't realize that.
The distances are big.
Yeah.
And even within China,
The
the
distances
distances
are
are enormous.
considerable.
China's the size of the United States.
Exactly.
Our upcoming tour is going in the north in Beijing to Nanning in the south, and then to Shanghai. Routing's a challenge.
Yes, it is.
Looking ahead, how do you imagine the sort of international circuit for Broadway-style entertainment to grow? How do you imagine it will grow? And say, what will it look like in, say, 5 or 10 years?
I think it's going to be a lot more than it is now. Again, I think it's very much an economic issue as the Chinese economy continues to grow, as there increases to be a middle class, with available funds, and to the extent that there's continued interest in exploring other outside cultural aspects other than the Chinese culture. And if you take that model and place it in any number of other potential companies around the world, the potential growth in the future, I think, in the near future, for Broadway-style entertainment is huge. We haven't touched really upon South America, for example, but it's just now
My
starting
next
to show.
question was, tell me more, tell us about some of the other markets that you think.
Again, it's in the same way that Korea is now what Japan was 30 years ago. South America, I think, it's just on the edge of starting to make that move, and it'll increasingly become a market.
Yeah. It's
Very
hard. It's
early
challenging.
stages.
Very challenging because of the distances. The distances are even more intense than they are in Asia. I mean, you really need to jump sets to make South America work. You can't really have one set touring South America because they're very, very. You have to fly them. It's impossible. You just can't make that tour happen. So you really have to have 2 sets moving simultaneously.
Wow.
And at the moment, there's only maybe 5 cities in all of South America that are even remotely potential for touring. And if you figure from Buenos Aires to Rio is a 2-day journey by land.
Yeah. But there are major markets coming online. I mean, we have our first show opening in South Africa. We produced a musical based on SpongeBob SquarePants. We produced it out of Singapore, actually, 2 years ago. It's great. It's a big, giant Broadway-sized musical, singing and dancing, all live. And we're opening in South Africa on December 15th in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And it's a market I've been wanting to go to. I'm always interested in seeing what else is out there for expansion. We've got some deals happening in Scandinavia right now. Scandinavia is a very lucrative market. So I think that the international markets are really growing. I think that one of the challenges that we all face, the 3 of us, about this is that we really need our labor unions to be in line with understanding the international markets. Our contracts currently do not deal with the reality of these markets in any way whatsoever. In structure, in per diems, in timing, in dates, and it just doesn't, they haven't embraced the global market because when they were written, there was no global market. So I think that that's something that will come upon us in the coming years to be able to deal with the international markets. But I do agree with Helen. I think that it is a major area of growth and will continue to be.
And also, just to go back to something we touched upon earlier, I think alongside the growth of American productions traveling overseas and vice versa, I think we're going to see much, much more local production. And I think to date, it's fair to say, if you take shows like Les Miserables or Chicago, those titles have had many, many productions around the world, locally produced, using the original designs for the better part. And what in some ways will lead the way, I think, in terms of developing local production is going to be the major title shows that come from Broadway or the West End.
To set the example.
Exactly. And those are also, of course, the titles that offer the economic potential to make producing a production locally sensible. You might not think that certain shows which won't go named would play more than a week, and other shows which do go named could play 2-3 months,
Yeah.
enough to justify mounting a production specifically for the territory.
And do you see anything, Bob, do you see anything in particular, well, since your focus is China, where do you see China being in 5 years?
The growth in the market is not, of course, our particular interest in the new venues which are coming online. I've already mentioned there are literally hundreds that will be up and running within the next couple of years. They're beautiful facilities. There's a need for content. Some of that's going to come from shows that come from Broadway. Simone and Alan will supply some of those certainly, but the bulk of it will come from China itself, and whether that's adaptations of Broadway shows or through the creation of their own productions, that will be certainly the bulk of the market in China, given the scale of what's happening today. But in order for that to happen, there's the infrastructure necessary to produce locally doesn't quite exist, and that's something that I know Simone's been tapped to help with, as are we, to assist with that. And certainly it's my expectation that shows will also tour internationally and come back to the United States.
Well, our time is up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
for
Thank you
joining
very
us.
much.
And thank you for joining us. These programs are brought to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in partnership with our friends at CUNY TV. On behalf of the American Theater Wing, I'm Gordon Cox, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Working in the Theater.
I'm Ted Chapin, chairman of the American Theater Wing. The Wing has played a vital role in New York's theatrical life for more than 60 years. Best known for creating the Tony Awards, we stand for excellence, but we also support education in the theater, and our work reaches beyond Broadway in New York. The Working in the Theater television programs, which are supported by the Annenberg Foundation and the Dorothy Strelsin Foundation, are unequaled forums for discussions with today's most creative artists. Downstage Center's in-depth radio interviews were created in conjunction with XM Satellite Radio and can be heard on our website. Our annual theater company grants support New York not-for-profits, and since they began, have distributed nearly $3 million. We are also pleased to be the home of the Jonathan Larson Grants, which support emerging composers and lyricists. For people who are starting their careers, we have a 2-week boot camp for aspiring actors from colleges across the country called Springboard NYC. And our theater intern group provides a forum for young people who are starting their careers to build a professional network. All of the American Theater Wing's educational and media programs are available for free on demand from our website, americantheaterwing.org. Thanks for your interest in the Wing, and thanks for watching.